Timothy Murphy said it clearly, loudly, where others could hear. He was bankrupt. And because of that, he said his wife had to leave. Faith Murphy stood on the edge of the parking lot, a single suitcase at her feet, while Timothy held eviction papers like proof of virtue. He explained himself to strangers, as if giving testimony how he had nothing left, how she was now a financial risk. No one interrupted. No one questioned him. Faith didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She didn't remind him whose money had kept the lights on when his accounts were empty. She only looked down at her phone at a quiet record he had never asked to see one, that named her not as a burden, but as his largest creditor. This story isn't about shouting back. It's about what happens when silence is backed by records, timing, and the law. If you believe dignity matters, even when no one is watching, stay with this story until the end. Let us know where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. And if stories about quiet strength and real justice belong in your feed, consider subscribing. The night Faith Murphy was evicted did not begin with shouting. It began with order. Timothy Murphy had chosen the hour carefully, just after sunset, when neighbors were home but not yet behind closed doors. The parking lot lights had flickered on, washing the concrete in pale white, turning everything slightly unreal. Faith noticed that detail first, the way the light flattened faces and made every movement look official, as if the scene were already a record. Her suitcase stood upright beside her, the zipper half open because she had packed in a hurry. Timothy had given her 20 minutes. Not as an act of cruelty, he said, but as a courtesy. "I don't want this to get complicated," he told her, his voice calm, practiced. "I've already explained everything to management." Management, it turned out, meant Mark Reynolds, the building supervisor, who hovered near the entrance with a clipboard and an expression carefully trained to look neutral. Mark had been told this was a bankruptcy situation, a legal necessity. A man doing what he had to do. Faith didn't correct him. She walked through the apartment one last time, touching nothing. The couch where Timothy used to fall asleep with his laptop open. The kitchen counter she had wiped down that morning, not knowing it would be for the last time. She left the spare key on the table, aligned neatly with the edge, because disorder had never helped anyone understand the truth faster. When she came back outside, Timothy was already explaining himself to Linda Parker from 3B, who had stepped out with her dog and stayed. "I tried everything," Timothy was saying. "But when you're bankrupt, you have to make hard choices." Linda's eyes flicked toward Faith, then back to Timothy. She nodded slowly, as people do when they are being asked to agree with something they don't fully believe. Faith stood a few steps away, the night air cool against her arms. She held her phone loosely in one hand. The screen was dark. She wasn't recording. She didn't need to. "Faith," Timothy said, turning toward her with a sigh that suggested patience. "I'll have my lawyer email you. This doesn't have to turn ugly." She met his eyes then. Not with anger, not with disbelief, just with attention. "I'd like a copy of the papers," she said. Timothy hesitated just for a second. It was small, but Faith noticed it. He recovered quickly, flipping the packet in his hand. "You'll get everything through proper channels," he replied. "This is all standard." Mark Reynolds cleared his throat. "Ma'am, if you need more time," No, Faith said gently. "This is fine." That seemed to surprise them more than anything else. She lifted her suitcase, the wheels catching briefly on the uneven pavement. Timothy stepped aside, careful not to touch her. There were rules now, he seemed to believe. Boundaries created by paperwork. As she walked toward her car, Linda called out Faith. Faith stopped. "I'm sorry," Linda said. It wasn't an apology for anything specific. It was the kind people offered when they sensed a story wasn't finished but didn't yet know their role in it. "Thank you," Faith replied. She meant it. She placed the suitcase in the trunk and sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. From there, she could still see Timothy still talking, still shaping the narrative. A man abandoned by circumstances. A man forced into action. Faith rested her forehead briefly against the steering wheel. She didn't cry. Crying required the belief that something had gone wrong unexpectedly. This, she realized, had been coming for a long time. Her phone vibrated. It was an email notification, not new, but resurfaced by her search history. She had typed a single word into the search bar: loan. The subject line appeared again, dated 7 years earlier. Loan confirmation for records. She opened it. The language was plain. No drama. Just numbers, dates, and Timothy's signature at the bottom, thanking her for stepping in when no one else could and promising repayment once things stabilize. Things had stabilized, just not the way he meant. Faith closed the email and opened her Notes app. She created a new file, Eviction Timeline. She wrote the date, the time, the exact words Timothy had used, the names of the people present. She didn't embellish. She didn't interpret. She wrote as if someone else would one day need to understand this moment without her standing there to explain it. After she finished, she finally started the car. She didn't know yet where she would sleep. She had options: friends, short-term rentals, but she didn't rush the decision. Urgency was a luxury for people who thought power lived in noise. As she drove, the city slid past her windows, familiar streets suddenly distant. Her phone vibrated again. This time it was a text from an unknown number. "This is Linda from 3B. I don't know if this matters, but what he said didn't match the papers he showed Mark. "If you need me to explain later, I will." Faith pulled over. She read the message twice. Then she saved the number with a single word: witness. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she took a breath and let the quiet settle. Not the quiet of defeat, but the quiet of accumulation, of facts aligning themselves. Timothy believed the night had ended with her departure, that the story had reached its conclusion. Faith knew better. She drove on, carrying nothing with her but a suitcase, a phone, and a record of truths that did not need to raise their voice to be heard. By morning, Timothy Murphy's version of events had already begun to circulate. He told it casually over coffee with a colleague, in a late-night phone call with his sister, in an email to his business partner marked confidential. The language stayed consistent. He had been forced into an impossible position. Bankruptcy left him no room. Evicting Faith had been painful but necessary. He emphasized how calm he had been, how reasonable. He even mentioned that she had taken it well, as if her silence were proof of his decency. What Timothy did not mention were the details that didn't fit. He did not mention the new sedan parked in the underground garage, still smelling faintly of leather and plastic. He did not mention the credit card charges that continued to clear Meals Gas, a hotel room 2 towns over. He did not mention that the bankruptcy he spoke of had not yet been filed anywhere official. Faith noticed these things because she was trained to notice patterns, not because she was suspicious by nature. She had learned over years of balancing household budgets and smoothing over Timothy's cash flow emergencies that money told the truth long before people did. She spent that morning at a small cafe on the edge of town, the kind that didn't ask questions if you stayed too long. She ordered tea she barely touched and opened her laptop, not to confront, not to accuse, to verify. She pulled her credit report first, clean, stable. Then Timothy's accessible because their finances had once been intertwined, because trust had been assumed. What she saw made her pause. There were no flags that suggested collapse. No delinquencies large enough to justify the urgency of eviction. No legal filings to support the narrative he had performed so confidently the night before. Faith opened a spreadsheet and labeled the columns carefully. Claim, evidence, contradictions. She worked slowly, methodically. She listed Timothy's statements verbatim as she remembered them. "I'm bankrupt. I have nothing left. The lawyers told me I had to act immediately." Then she matched each claim against what she could confirm. A loan payment had gone out 3 days earlier to a vendor she didn't recognize. A lease payment on a storage unit. A wire transfer that didn't belong in a household budget at all. She leaned back in her chair, letting the noise of the cafe wash over her. Cups clinked. Someone laughed. Life continued around her, indifferent to the quiet unraveling of a story built too quickly. Faith didn't feel anger. What she felt was clarity. Timothy hadn't evicted her because he was bankrupt. He had evicted her because he believed he was about to be. There was a difference. One that mattered legally. One that mattered morally. Her phone buzzed. A voicemail notification. It was from Mark Reynolds. "Miss Murphy," he said, his voice cautious. "I just wanted to clarify something. The paperwork Mr. Murphy showed me last night, it wasn't finalized. I assumed well. I assumed there was more. If you need a statement, I can provide one." Faith saved the message and noted the time. She didn't reply yet. She spent the afternoon reconstructing the weeks leading up to the eviction. Timothy's late nights, the sudden secrecy around his laptop, the way he had started referring to my accounts instead of ours long before he claimed there was nothing left to share. By evening, she had built a timeline that told a very different story. A story of anticipation, not collapse. Of rearrangement, not desperation. She forwarded the file to herself, backed it up twice, then closed her laptop, and allowed herself a moment to sit with what she knew. That was when she remembered the email. Not the loan confirmation, the other one. The one that had never quite made sense at the time. She searched again, this time by date, 8 months earlier. A forwarded message Timothy had sent her accidentally, then brushed off as a mistake. It had been from someone named Rachel Collins, discussing clean separation and limiting exposure. Faith read it now with new eyes. Rachel's tone was not legal but strategic. She spoke of optics, of timing, of removing liabilities before formal filings. Faith had been listed not as a person, but as a variable. Faith closed the email and stared at the screen. She didn't know Rachel Collins well, just a name Timothy had mentioned in passing, a consultant he had started seeing around the same time his behavior shifted. At the time, Faith had accepted the explanation. She had always accepted explanations when they were offered calmly. She didn't now. She added a new line to her spreadsheet. Advisor influence present prior to eviction. That night, Faith stayed with a friend who asked gentle questions and didn't push when Faith answered only what was necessary. After a shower and a borrowed t-shirt, Faith sat on the edge of the bed and opened her phone again. Another email had arrived. This one was from Timothy. "We should keep things civil. The less noise, the better for both of us." Faith read it twice. She did not respond. She knew now that Timothy's greatest mistake was not the eviction itself. It was his belief that silence belonged to him. That by acting first and speaking loudest, he controlled the ending. Faith had learned something different long ago. Silence belonged to whoever could afford to wait. The next morning, she scheduled an appointment with an attorney. Not because she wanted to fight, but because she wanted structure. She printed her timeline, her emails, her bank records, and placed them in a plain folder without labels. Before she left, she checked her phone one more time. A new message from Linda Parker. "I keep thinking about last night. He said he'd already filed. But Mark told me this morning he hadn't seen any court stamp. Just wanted you to know." Faith typed a reply. "Thank you. That helps." She placed the phone face down on the table and took a breath. The story Timothy had told was beginning to contradict itself. And every contradiction was not a crack, but a door. Faith stepped through quietly, carrying with her not outrage, not revenge, but something far more dangerous to a false narrative. Documentation. Faith Murphy had never thought of her savings as leverage. For most of her marriage, she thought of it as insulation, a quiet buffer against the instability Timothy seemed to attract without ever acknowledging. She saved the way some people prayed regularly, without drama and without expecting recognition for it. She began with small transfers in the early years when Timothy's business was young and his confidence outpaced his cash flow. Rent came due before invoices cleared. Vendors needed reassurance. Timothy would pace the apartment, rehearsing optimism out loud. I just need a bridge, he would say, just until things settle. Faith had been the bridge. She sat now at a borrowed desk in her friend's spare room, the morning light angled low over through the blinds, and opened her banking portal. Not to relive the past emotionally, but to reconstruct it accurately. Each transfer appeared with the same clarity it had the day she made it. Dates, amounts, notes she had insisted on including even when Timothy rolled his eyes. Temporary loan, to be reimbursed, for operating expenses. She remembered how he used to laugh at that. "You're my wife," he'd say, "not a bank." She had smiled back then, but she had kept writing the notes anyway. Faith scrolled further back. The amounts grew larger over time, the intervals more frequent. Each transfer had been made deliberately from her personal savings account, never from joint funds. Not because she didn't trust him, but because she understood something Timothy didn't. Intent mattered. She opened the folder where she had stored email confirmations. Timothy's replies were polite, even grateful, especially at first. "I don't know what I'd do without you. I'll make this right as soon as things stabilize. Thank you for believing in me." There was one email she lingered on longer than the rest. It was from 5 years ago, sent after a particularly large transfer. "I know this isn't ideal," Timothy had written, "but once the company turns the corner, I'll formalize everything. You have my word." Faith hadn't replied. She had forwarded it to herself, instead added a note and archived it. She hadn't needed his word. She needed proof. What struck her now was not that Timothy had forgotten these loans. It was that he had begun to treat them as invisible the moment they stopped being convenient. As if the money once absorbed into his business lost its origin. As if her role in keeping him solvent had been erased by repetition. Faith pulled out a legal pad and began listing each transfer, chronologically matching them to bank statements and emails. The pattern was unmistakable. Without her money, Timothy's accounts would have dipped into default multiple times. Without her restraint, his bankruptcy would have arrived years earlier and publicly. She paused, pen hovering above the page. This wasn't emotional support. This wasn't spousal generosity. This was financing. And financing created relationships Timothy had never bothered to name. Her phone buzzed, a calendar reminder she had set the night before. Consult, Daniel Brooks, attorney. Faith gathered her papers into the folder. She didn't add labels. She didn't highlight. She wanted the facts to speak without embellishment. The law office was understated, tucked between a dental practice and a small insurance firm. Daniel Brooks greeted her with a firm handshake and an expression that suggested patience rather than urgency. They sat across from each other in a quiet room with no view. "Start wherever you like," Daniel said. Faith did not start with the eviction. She started with the money. She laid out the documents in order, explaining each transfer without commentary. Daniel listened occasionally, nodding occasionally, asking for clarification. When she finished, he sat back slightly and folded his hands. "Did your husband ever dispute these loans?" he asked. "No," Faith said. He acknowledged them. In writing. Daniel scanned one of the emails again. "Did he repay any portion, small amounts?" Faith replied. "Inconsistent. Never enough to close the balance. And the eviction happened before any formal bankruptcy filing." "Yes," Daniel exhaled slowly. "Miss Murphy, based on what I'm seeing, you're not just involved in this situation. You're central to it." Faith met his eyes. "In what way?" "In the simplest terms," he said, "you are his creditor. Possibly his largest." The word landed without ceremony. No gavel, no music. Just recognition. Faith felt something shift, not in her chest, but in her posture. The story she had been living inside rearranged itself, aligning with the evidence she had always carried. "I don't want revenge," she said quietly. "I don't want to embarrass him," as Daniel nodded. "That's good. Because what you have isn't leverage for spectacle. It's leverage for procedure." He explained what came next carefully. Bankruptcy filings required disclosure. Creditors had rights. Omitted debts were not erased by silence. they were magnified by it. If he files, Daniel said, and fails to list you accurately, that becomes a problem. Not for you, for him. Faith absorbed this without expression. "What do you need from me?" she asked. "Nothing yet," Daniel replied. "You wait, you document. You let him make the next move." That night, Faith returned to her friend's apartment and sat at the small dining table with her folder open. She added one final document to the stack, a summary sheet totaling the outstanding balance Timothy owed her. The number was larger than she remembered. Not because she hadn't known it, but because seeing it in one place stripped it of narrative. It was no longer a favor or a sacrifice or a gesture of love. It was a debt. Her phone vibrated again. A new email from Timothy. "I've been advised to move forward with formal filings this week. This doesn't have to be adversarial." Faith read it once, then archived it. She did not respond. She closed the folder, placed it in her bag, and turned off the light. Timothy believed he had removed a liability from his life. That by pushing Faith out quietly, he had simplified his future. He did not understand that in doing so, he had converted a private act of trust into a public matter of record. Faith lay awake for a long time, not replaying the eviction, not imagining confrontation, but considering the weight of patience, the discipline it required, the restraint it demanded. She had saved for years without being asked. She had recorded without being praised. She had waited without being seen. Now she would let the system catch up to what she had always known. Money remembered, paper remembered, and soon so would the law. The public part of the eviction lingered longer than Faith Murphy expected. It wasn't because people talked loudly about it. It was because they didn't. In the days that followed, conversations paused when she entered a room. Glances lingered a second too long. Sympathy was offered carefully, as if acknowledging her directly might mean choosing sides. Faith noticed all of it. She simply didn't engage. She returned to the building once 2 days later to retrieve a package that had arrived late. Mark Reynolds met her at the entrance, clipboard still tucked under his arm, his posture more rigid than before. "I can escort you if you want," he said. "That won't be necessary," Faith replied. As they walked down the hallway, she became acutely aware of the way the space held sound. Every step echoed. Every door seemed closer than it had before. She passed Linda Parker's apartment and felt a brief, wordless exchange through the closed door, a mutual awareness that neither of them needed to voice. The package was small. Books she had ordered weeks earlier. Faith signed for it without comment. Before she left, Mark cleared his throat. "I should tell you," he said, lowering his voice. "There were questions after you went. Questions Faith asked. About the paperwork," he said. "Timothy said everything had already been filed. But when I looked closer, it didn't match standard procedure. I didn't say anything at the time." Faith nodded. "I understand. I can write a statement," Mark added quickly. "About what I saw, about what was said." Faith met his eyes. "Thank you. I may ask for that later." She did not take his contact information. She already had it. Outside, the sun was bright and unremarkable. Faith sat in her car and made a note in her phone. Mark Reynolds' hallway conversation. Uncertainty about filings. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. That evening, Linda Parker knocked on the door of the friend's apartment where Faith was staying. She brought a container of soup and an expression that hovered somewhere between concern and resolve. "I hope this isn't intrusive," Linda said. Things haven't been sitting right with me." Faith invited her in. They sat at the small kitchen table, steam rising gently between them. "I've lived next to you two for 4 years," Linda said. "I've seen hard times. What happened the other night didn't feel like one of those." Faith listened. "He kept saying bankrupt." Linda continued, over and over, like he needed us to hear it. "But the papers he waved around, those weren't court documents. My brother went through bankruptcy." "I recognize the difference." Faith didn't interrupt. "And the way he spoke to you," Linda said quietly, "wasn't desperation. It was rehearsed." That word again. Rehearsed. Faith thanked her and asked if she would be willing to write down what she remembered. Linda agreed immediately. "I don't want to gossip," Linda said, "but I don't want to lie by omission either." After Linda left, Faith added another note. Witness corroboration, language and documentation inconsistent with true bankruptcy. The pattern was becoming clearer. Timothy hadn't just evicted her, he had staged the eviction. He had needed an audience. He had needed validation. Faith considered why. Public humiliation, she realized, wasn't a byproduct. It was a tool. If others believed she was the problem, a financial drain, a liability, then his actions would appear justified, necessary even. And if she stayed quiet, that narrative would harden. But Faith wasn't quiet. She was precise. She spent the next 2 days compiling statements, not affidavits, yet just recollections, time-stamped and dated. Linda's account, Mark's uncertainty. Even her own memory of the language Timothy used, the specific phrases he repeated. She didn't label them accusations. She labeled them observations. Meanwhile, Timothy continued to perform stability. Faith saw it indirectly through social media posts she didn't engage with but noted. A photo of him at a networking event, a caption about resilience, a comment from Rachel Collins praising his strength. Rachel Collins. Faith searched the name again, this time more deliberately. Public records, business registrations, consulting firms that appeared and disappeared within short windows of time. Rachel had a habit of positioning herself close to transitions, mergers, separations, financial restructuring, and now evictions. Faith didn't draw conclusions she couldn't support. She simply added another tab to her spreadsheet. Rachel Collins' timeline overlap. On the 4th day, Daniel Brooks called. "He hasn't filed yet," he said without preamble. "But he's close." "Does that matter?" Faith asked. "It does," Daniel replied. "Because the closer he gets, the more his omissions will matter." Faith thanked him and hung up. She sat with her notes spread out before her, the kitchen quiet. There was a strange calm in seeing the pieces align. Not satisfaction, something steadier. She thought about the way Timothy had looked that night, holding the eviction papers like a shield. The confidence, the relief, as if pushing her out had unburdened him of something heavier than debt. Faith understood now what that burden had been. Accountability. Her phone buzzed again. A message from Timothy. "I heard you were talking to people in the building. I'd appreciate it if you didn't complicate things." Faith stared at the screen for a long moment. Then she typed a single reply. "I haven't said anything that isn't true." She placed the phone face down. The humiliation Timothy had inflicted publicly had done something he hadn't anticipated. It had created witnesses. And witnesses, unlike rumors, could be documented. Faith gathered her papers into their folder and placed it back in her bag. She didn't know yet when the turning point would arrive. But she could feel it approaching, not with urgency, but with inevitability. The law, she knew, did not respond to emotion. It responded to records. And those records were no longer hers alone. Faith Murphy did not look for proof of betrayal. It found her anyway. It arrived the way inconvenient truths often did. Not through confrontation, but through overlap. Dates that touched when they shouldn't. Emails that referenced meetings Faith had never heard about. Expenses that sat just outside the margins of plausibility. Rachel Collins remained on paper a consultant. That was the title Timothy used when he mentioned her at all. A strategist. Someone who helped with transitions. The vagueness had once felt harmless. Now it felt deliberate. Faith began with calendars. She opened Timothy's shared business calendar access he had never revoked because he had never considered it a risk. She cross-referenced it with bank statements, travel receipts, and email timestamps. The result was not dramatic, but it was consistent. Meetings labeled financial review that coincided with unexplained transfers. Lunches that stretched into evenings in cities where Rachel's consulting firm had temporary addresses. Calls that took place just after midnight, their durations too long to be professional, too frequent to be incidental. Faith did not speculate. She documented, She added a new page to her notes. Third-party influence prior to eviction. Under it, she listed what she could verify. Rachel Collins began appearing in Timothy's correspondence months before the eviction. Her language was careful but revealing. She spoke in terms of exposure, of simplification, of clean exits. Faith noticed that she never once mentioned repayment reconciliation or shared responsibility. In one email, Rachel wrote, "The key is to separate liabilities before formal proceedings. Emotional attachments complicate financial clarity." Faith read the sentence twice. She did not forward it. She saved it. What struck Faith most was not the suggestion itself, but Timothy's response. "Agreed," he had written. "I'm ready to move forward." Move forward from what Faith wondered. From debt, from marriage, from accountability. She sat back in her chair and closed her eyes briefly, not in pain, in recalibration. This was not about infidelity, though that possibility now felt likely. It was about alignment, about who Timothy had chosen to listen to when the stakes were highest. And he had not chosen her. Faith printed the email and placed it behind the loan confirmations in her folder. She did not annotate it. The words spoke clearly enough on their own. Later that afternoon, she met Daniel Brooks again. This time, she brought fewer documents, but heavier ones. Daniel read the email carefully, his expression unchanged. "This suggests intent," he said finally, "not to cheat on you, to structure his finances in a way that avoids certain obligations," mine, Faith said. "Yes," Daniel replied, "specifically yours." Faith nodded. "Does that change anything?" she asked. "It clarifies things," Daniel said. "If he files and omits you, this becomes more than a technical oversight. It becomes a pattern." Faith absorbed this. "And Rachel Collins?" Daniel hesitated. "She's not my concern unless she becomes part of the paper trail." "She already is," Faith said quietly. Daniel looked up. He studied her for a moment, not skeptically, but with a kind of professional respect. "Then we wait," he said, "and we watch what he submits." That night, Faith slept without interruption for the first time since the eviction. Not because she felt safe, but because she felt oriented. She knew where she was in the story now, and more importantly, where she wasn't. She wasn't chasing explanations. She wasn't trying to be heard. She was preparing to be recognized. The next morning, Timothy filed. Faith learned this not from him, but from the court notification system Daniel had enrolled her in. The filing appeared with a timestamp and a case number. Impersonal, procedural. Faith opened the documents with the same care she had applied to everything else. She scanned the schedules slowly, line by line. Assets, liabilities, creditors. Her name was there. Misspelled. The amount owed to her was listed at a fraction of the actual balance. Faith did not react immediately. She read it again, checking for error. There was none. This was not a clerical mistake. It was an intentional minimization. Daniel called an hour later. "He listed you," he said, "but not accurately." I saw Faith replied. "That gives us standing," Daniel said, "and leverage." Faith closed her eyes. "What do you need from me?" "Nothing new," Daniel replied. "Just confirmation that the numbers he listed are incorrect, and patience." Faith confirmed the discrepancy and ended the call. She spent the rest of the day doing something she had neglected for weeks, reminding herself who she was outside of Timothy's narrative. She went for a walk. She cooked a simple dinner. She read a book she had started months earlier and never finished. In the evening, her phone buzzed. A message from Timothy. "I filed. I tried to be fair. If you have concerns, let's discuss them privately." Faith read the message without expression. She did not respond. Instead, she forwarded it to Daniel. "Client attempting direct contact post-filing," she typed. Daniel replied within minutes. "Noted. Do not engage." Faith set the phone down and looked around the room. The borrowed furniture, the quiet, the sense of impermanence that no longer frightened her. Timothy believed he had reduced her to a line item, that by misspelling her name and shrinking her claim, he had managed her significance. What he did not understand was that accuracy mattered now more than volume. that the system he had entered did not reward confidence or performance. It rewarded truth documented and submitted on time. Faith opened her folder one last time that night and added a new sheet at the front. Creditor claim correction. She filled it out carefully, attaching every supporting document. She did not rush. She did not dramatize. When she finished, she placed the folder back in her bag and zipped it closed. The betrayal, she realized, was not that Timothy had chosen someone else's counsel over hers. It was that he believed she would disappear quietly once removed from the picture. He had mistaken restraint for absence. And soon, in a room governed by procedure rather than persuasion, that mistake would be made visible. Faith Murphy learned quickly that the legal system rewarded discipline more than urgency. Daniel Brooks explained it to her during their next meeting, seated across a conference table that bore no markings of hierarchy. No seal, no flag, just a legal pad, a pen, and a clock that ticked without sympathy. The instinct is to correct the record immediately, Daniel said. Most people rush. They argue. They demand explanations. And that's a mistake, Faith said. Daniel nodded. Because the moment you react emotionally, you surrender control of the timeline. Faith listened carefully. She had already surrendered enough timelines in her life to Timothy's moods, to his crises, to his definition of what mattered and when. She would not do it again. What we do instead, Daniel continued, is let him finish telling his story. Fully, in writing, under penalty of perjury. Faith understood the weight of that phrase. Under penalty of perjury, stories became commitments, and commitments had consequences. Daniel slid a document across the table. It was a draft, clean, restrained, unemotional. Proof of claim. This is how you speak now, Daniel said. Not through conversation, through procedure. Faith read the form slowly. It asked for nothing more than facts. Creditor name, amount owed, basis of claim, supporting documentation. She noticed something almost gentle about it. The form did not accuse. It did not argue. It simply asserted existence. I don't have to explain why he evicted me, Faith said. No, Daniel replied. You don't have to explain anything. You only have to show what is owed. They went through the attachments one by one. Bank statements, email confirmations. The spreadsheet Faith had built late at night, cross-checked and dated. Daniel stopped at one. Document the email from Timothy promising to formalize repayment once the company stabilized. This, he said, tapping the page lightly, is where your silence becomes dangerous for him. Faith looked at the words again. She had read them dozens of times. But now in this context, they carried a different weight. Not sentiment, admission. Daniel leaned back. Here's what will happen. We file this. The trustee reviews it. Timothy will have an opportunity to object. If he does, he'll have to explain why your claim is inaccurate. And if he doesn't, Faith asked? Then it stands, Daniel said, as filed. Faith nodded once. That afternoon she signed the form, not with satisfaction, with a finality. The proof of claim was submitted electronically. A confirmation number appeared on the screen, a timestamp, an acknowledgement. Faith watched it without expression. This is the first moment, Daniel said, that the narrative stops belonging to him. Faith left the office feeling lighter, not because anything had been resolved, but because the direction was now fixed. There would be no shortcuts, no dramatic confrontations, just steps, each one documented. That evening, Timothy called. She let it go to voicemail. His message was longer than usual. Faith, he said, his tone careful, I'm hearing some things that concern me. I don't know why you'd file something like this without talking to me first. I thought we agreed to keep this civil. Faith listened to the message once. Then she deleted it. She did not save it. She did not forward it. She did not annotate it. It had no evidentiary value, and therefore it had no power. The next few days passed quietly. Faith returned to work, grateful for the routine. She answered emails, attended meetings, lived inside a version of herself that had nothing to do with Timothy or Rachel or bankruptcy filings. But the quiet was deceptive. Behind the scenes, the system was moving. Daniel called her at the end of the week. "The trustee has acknowledged your claim," he said, "and they've flagged discrepancies." Faith closed her eyes briefly. "What kind amounts?" "Timing. The nature of the debt," Daniel said. "They'll likely request additional documentation from Timothy." Faith said nothing. "And there's something else," Daniel added. "Your claim is larger than any other unsecured creditor listed." Faith let that settle. "What does that mean?" she asked. "It means Daniel said that you are now central to the case, whether he likes it or not." Faith ended the call and sat at her desk for a long moment, hands folded, breathing evenly. She thought of the night she had been evicted, the way Timothy had stood so confidently, eviction papers in hand, explaining himself to strangers as if the story were already finished. She wondered if he felt the shift yet, if he sensed the weight of procedure pressing in. Her phone buzzed again. A text message this time. Rachel Collins. "We should talk. I think there's been a misunderstanding." Faith stared at the screen. Rachel Collins had never contacted her directly before. Faith did not respond. She forwarded the message to Daniel with a single line. "Third party attempting contact post-filing." Daniel replied almost immediately. "Do not engage. Save everything." Faith saved the message and placed the phone face down. She understood now why silence unnerved people like Timothy and Rachel. Because silence, when paired with documentation, removed the possibility of manipulation. There was nothing to argue against, nothing to persuade. Only records waiting to be reviewed. That weekend, Faith organized her folder one final time. Not because she needed to add anything, but because she wanted to be prepared. She arranged the documents in the order Daniel had suggested. She labeled the tabs clearly. She printed duplicates and placed them in a second folder just in case. She didn't rehearse what she would say if asked. She didn't imagine the look on Timothy's face. She imagined the room instead. The fluorescent lights, the table, the trustee reading aloud from documents Faith had prepared in silence. The law would speak for her, and it would speak without emotion. On Sunday evening, as she zipped her bag closed, Faith felt something she hadn't felt since before the eviction. Stability. Not the illusion Timothy had chased. The real kind. The kind built slowly, deliberately, and protected by clarity. Timothy had believed that pushing Faith out would simplify his future. What he had done instead was invite her into a system where stories were tested against facts. And Faith Murphy had never been unprepared for that kind of scrutiny. The filing changed the air around Timothy Murphy. Faith didn't witness it directly. She felt it in the way the system began to surface him through notices, requests, and timelines that no longer bent to his preferences. Bankruptcy, once a word he used to control a room, had become a process that controlled him. Daniel Brooks forwarded the first trustee request late Monday morning. Request for additional documentation regarding creditor listings and asset transfers. Faith read the attachment slowly. It wasn't accusatory. It didn't suggest wrongdoing. It simply asked for clarification. Dates, sources, explanations. The kind of questions that exposed gaps. "Is this normal?" Faith asked when Daniel called. "Very," Daniel said. "What's unusual is how early it's happening." Faith understood what he didn't say. The earlier the questions arrived, the more visible the inconsistencies had become. That afternoon, Timothy amended his schedules. Faith saw the update through the same notification system. A revised filing, adjusted figures, minor corrections presented as routine. Her name was still misspelled. The amount owed to her increased slightly, but not enough to reflect the documented balance. Daniel sighed when he saw it. He's trying to look cooperative without conceding ground. "Does that work?" Faith asked. "Sometimes," Daniel replied. "Not when the paper trail is this clean." Faith spent the evening reviewing bank records she had already reviewed twice. She didn't expect to find anything new. She was looking for alignment, confirmation that what she had prepared would withstand repetition. She noticed something she had overlooked before. a series of transfers made shortly after Timothy stopped repaying her in earnest. Smaller amounts, spread out, sent to an account that didn't belong to his business. She traced the account. It led to a newly formed LLC, registered 3 months earlier. Address listed as a shared workspace across town. The registered agent was Rachel Collins. Faith did not react outwardly. She saved the document, took a screenshot of the registration, and added it to her folder with the same restraint she applied to everything else. She sent Daniel a brief message. Found transfers to LLC registered to Rachel Collins. Dates align with reduced repayments. Daniel responded within minutes. That's significant. Do not contact her. Faith hadn't planned to. The next morning, Timothy requested a meeting through his attorney. Daniel read the email aloud during their call. They're proposing an informal discussion to resolve discrepancies. Is that advisable? Faith asked. Daniel paused. Only if it benefits you. Does it not yet? Daniel said. They want to negotiate before the trustee looks closer. Faith considered this. So they want to contain it. Yes. Then we wait, Faith said. Daniel smiled faintly. Exactly. Waiting, Faith had learned, was not passive. It required preparation without anticipation. She updated her spreadsheet with the newly discovered transfers, double-checking dates and amounts. She attached copies of the LLC registration. She printed everything and placed it behind the proof of claim. She didn't label the section. Labels suggested conclusions. She preferred facts. By Thursday, the trustee issued a formal notice of inquiry. It was addressed to Timothy and his attorney. Faith received a copy. The notice requested explanations for asset transfers within the 90 days preceding the filing. It asked for supporting documentation. It requested clarification regarding creditor omissions and inconsistencies. Faith read it once, then closed the document. She felt no surge of victory, only recognition. That night, Timothy called again. She let it ring. He left no voicemail this time. Instead, she received an email from his attorney, polite and measured. Our client is concerned about the direction this is taking. He believes there may be room for private resolution that would avoid unnecessary escalation. Faith forwarded it to Daniel. Daniel called her immediately. They're worried. About what? Faith asked. About scrutiny, Daniel said. About intent. Faith nodded. What do we do? We let the trustee do their job, Daniel replied, and we respond only when required. On Friday afternoon, Faith received a message from Linda Parker. I saw Timothy packing boxes last night. Didn't look planned, just thought you should know. Faith thanked her and saved the message. She didn't ask questions. She didn't speculate. But she understood what it meant. Timothy was reacting, adjusting, moving pieces without a clear map. That weekend, Faith stayed in. She cooked. She cleaned. She reorganized her bag so that the folder fit neatly without bending. On Sunday evening, Daniel sent her an update. The trustee has scheduled a meeting, he wrote. It's preliminary. But your claim will be discussed. Faith closed her laptop and sat quietly for a long time. She thought about the language Timothy had used the night of the eviction. I don't want this to get complicated. This is all standard. Nothing was standard anymore. The system did not care how calmly he had spoken. It did not care how convincingly he had performed hardship. It cared only about what he had done and what he could prove. He hadn't. Faith slept deeply that night, without dreams. The meeting arrived sooner than she expected. It wasn't held in a courtroom. There were no raised voices, no gallery, just a conference room, a trustee, and a stack of documents that did not belong to Timothy anymore. Faith attended remotely as advised. She sat at her desk camera on expression neutral. Timothy appeared on screen from a different location. He looked tired, not disheveled, but less certain. His attorney sat beside him, posture controlled. The trustee began with procedural questions. Timothy answered carefully, sometimes too carefully. When the topic turned to creditors, Faith's name came up. The trustee mispronounced it. Faith did not correct her. She waited. "Miss Murphy has filed a proof of claim," the trustee said. "Can you explain why the amount listed differs from your schedules?" Timothy hesitated. His attorney spoke first. "There may have been confusion regarding the nature of those transfers." "Confusion," the trustee repeated. "Mr. Murphy?" Timothy cleared his throat. They were informal. Spousal support. I didn't think the trustee raised a hand. "I'm not asking what you thought. I'm asking what documentation exists." Silence followed. Faith watched Timothy's face change, not dramatically, but subtly. The confidence that had carried him through the eviction did not translate here. There was no audience to persuade. No moral framing to lean on. Only records. The trustee continued. "Additionally, there are questions regarding recent transfers to an LLC associated with a Rachel Collins. We will require documentation for those transactions as well." Timothy's attorney nodded quickly. Timothy did not. Faith sat still, hands folded in her lap. She did not smile. She did not look away. This was not the turning point. It was the opening of a door. And for the first time since the night she had been told to leave, Timothy Murphy was no longer controlling the room. Bank records did not argue. They did not soften language or adjust tone. They did not care who felt justified. They simply existed. Faith Murphy understood this the moment Daniel Brooks sent her the trustee's formal request for supplemental financial disclosures. The list was precise. Dates, accounts, counterparties, supporting documents, no adjectives, no assumptions. Now, Daniel said during their call, this becomes arithmetic. Faith opened her folder and removed the section she had prepared weeks earlier, the one she hadn't labeled because labels implied persuasion. She spread the statements across her desk and began aligning them with the trustee's questions. The first set concerned Timothy's personal accounts. The pattern was immediately visible when once everything sat side by side. Deposits clustered around predictable business cycles. Withdrawals followed closely, often within 48 hours. The amounts Timothy had transferred to Faith slowed, then stopped at the same time new transfers began appearing elsewhere. Faith highlighted nothing. She didn't circle. She simply created a new spreadsheet. Date, amount, origin, destination, purpose as stated. Most purposes were blank. The second set of records belonged to the LLC registered under Rachel Collins' name. Daniel had obtained them through a formal request, limited but sufficient. The account had been quiet at first, just enough activity to appear legitimate. Then suddenly larger deposits appeared. Timothy's deposits. Faith cross-referenced the dates. Every significant transfer to Rachel's LLC coincided with a reduction or complete pause in repayments to her. It wasn't just correlation. It was substitution. Faith felt no surge of emotion at the realization. Only a tightening of focus. This wasn't about betrayal in the personal sense. It was about diversion. Money that should have reduced an existing obligation had been rerouted elsewhere. That afternoon, Faith met Daniel in person. He laid out the documents on the table between them, arranging them in a sequence that told its own story. This, he said, pointing to the first set, is what he claims he didn't have. And this, Faith said, gesturing to the second, is where it went. Daniel nodded. Exactly. Is that enough? Faith asked. It's enough to ask the next question, Daniel replied, which is whether these transfers were made in anticipation of filing. Faith leaned back in her chair. And if they were, then the trustee may consider them improper, Daniel said, possibly fraudulent. Faith absorbed that word without reaction. She had not come here to accuse Timothy of fraud. But she understood now that intent was not measured by feeling, it was inferred from timing. Daniel prepared a formal response to the trustee's request, attaching the spreadsheets and statements Faith had compiled. The language was restrained. The tone professional. Enclosed, please find records reflecting transfers made by the debtor to a third-party entity during the 90-day pre-filing period, corresponding with a cessation of repayment to creditor Faith Murphy. Nothing more. Faith reviewed the draft, once approved it, and watched as Daniel submitted it electronically. From here, Daniel said, we let the process apply pressure. The pressure arrived faster than Faith expected. 2 days later, Timothy filed another amendment. This time, the amount owed to Faith increased again, closer to the truth, but still incomplete. The explanation section was vague, referencing informal arrangements and non-standard repayment expectations. Daniel read it and shook his head. He's adjusting incrementally, hoping to appear cooperative without acknowledging the full obligation. Does that help him? Faith asked. It helps him look uncertain, Daniel replied. Which is worse. Faith did not follow Timothy's social media anymore. But the absence of posts reached her indirectly through silence where performance used to be. Linda Parker mentioned that he had stopped attending building events. A mutual acquaintance noted that he had canceled a conference appearance. The confidence Timothy had relied on was being eroded not by confrontation, but by scrutiny. On Friday afternoon, Faith received a notification that made her pause. Trustee has requested sworn statements regarding recent asset transfers. This was new. Daniel called her within minutes. This elevates things, meaning Faith asked. Meaning the trustee is no longer just clarifying, Daniel said. They're assessing credibility. Faith closed her eyes briefly. She had expected this moment, but she hadn't rushed toward it. There was a difference. What do I need to do? She asked. For now, Daniel said nothing. Your documentation speaks for itself. That evening, Timothy emailed her directly again. I don't recognize the way this is being framed. We both know those transfers weren't what they're being made out to be. Faith read the message carefully. It was defensive, not explanatory. It did not deny the transfers. It questioned interpretation. She forwarded it to Daniel and did not respond. The following week unfolded with measured intensity. The trustee requested additional bank records, older ones this time. Timothy's attorney requested extensions. Rachel Collins' name appeared more frequently in the filings, no longer peripheral. Faith spent her evenings checking documents against each other, ensuring consistency. She slept well, ate regularly, lived inside her body again rather than around it. On Wednesday, Daniel called with an update that shifted the ground slightly. The trustee has scheduled a continued meeting, he said, and they've requested your presence. Faith felt a flicker of awareness. Not fear, readiness. In person, she asked. Yes, Daniel said. You won't need to speak unless asked, but they want you there. Faith agreed. The meeting took place in a modest federal building downtown. The room was unadorned. A table, chairs, fluorescent lighting that left no room for dramatics. Timothy arrived early. Faith noticed him before he noticed her. He looked thinner, not ill, but worn. His suit was pressed, his posture controlled, but the ease was gone. Rachel Collins was not present. The trustee began with formalities. Then she turned to the subject of transfers. Mr. Murphy, she said you stated previously that you lacked funds to continue repayments to Miss Murphy. Yet records show contemporaneous transfers to a third-party entity. Can you explain the purpose of those transfers? Timothy glanced at his attorney, then back at the trustee. They were consulting fees, he said. For what services, the trustee asked. Timothy hesitated. Strategic planning. The trustee nodded once. Do you have invoices? Timothy's attorney interjected. We're in the process of gathering. I didn't ask about process, the trustee said calmly. I asked whether invoices exist. Silence followed. Faith sat still, hands folded. She did not look at Timothy. She did not need to. The trustee turned to her. Miss Murphy, she said, pronouncing her name correctly, this time did you consent to a reduction in repayments while these transfers were being made? No, Faith replied. That was all. No elaboration, no commentary. The trustee nodded and made a note. Thank you, she said. That's sufficient. As the meeting concluded, Timothy avoided Faith's gaze. His attorney spoke in hushed tones, urgent now. Outside, Daniel walked beside Faith in silence until they reached the steps. This is moving, he said finally. Faith looked at the building behind them. The plainness of it, the absence of spectacle. Yes, she said. It is. She understood now why Timothy had needed to humiliate her publicly, why he had framed the eviction as necessity rather than choice, why he had tried to erase the debt quietly, because when money told the truth, it told it plainly. And there was no performance capable of rewriting numbers that had already been recorded. The email that mattered most was not dramatic when Faith Murphy found it. It didn't contain threats or raised voices. It didn't announce intention in bold language. It sat quietly in her archive, dated months before the eviction, forwarded once, and never discussed again. Faith found it while preparing for the trustee's next request, searching for a different document entirely. The subject line was "unremarkable next steps," the kind of phrase that blended easily into any inbox. She opened it slowly. It was from Timothy to Rachel Collins. "If I move quickly, I can separate personal obligations before formal filings. Once that's done, the rest becomes procedural." Faith read the sentence again, then the rest of the thread. Rachel's reply followed within minutes. "Speed matters. Once you establish necessity, people won't question the order of events." Faith felt the words settle not as shock, but as confirmation. This was not confusion. This was planning. She forwarded the email to Daniel Brooks without comment. Daniel called her less than 10 minutes later. "This," he said, not bothering to mask the gravity, "is an admission of intent." Faith closed her eyes briefly. She did not feel vindicated. She felt steadied. "What does it change?" she asked. "It connects the eviction to the financial strategy," Daniel said. "It shows awareness, sequence, purpose." Faith nodded. "So it wasn't about survival?" "No," Daniel replied. "It was about control." Daniel asked her to forward the full thread, including metadata. Faith complied. She watched as he uploaded it into the case file, attaching it as a supplemental exhibit to her proof of claim. The submission was clean. Minimal language, length, maximum clarity. That afternoon, the trustee issued another notice. "Request for explanation regarding correspondence, suggesting pre-filing asset separation." Faith read it once and closed the document. She didn't need to interpret what was happening. The system was doing that for her now. Timothy, meanwhile, began to unravel not outwardly, but in the small, telltale ways Faith recognized from years of proximity. His emails grew longer, his explanations more elaborate. He began using phrases like "misunderstood" and "taken out of context." Faith received none of these messages directly anymore. Daniel filtered them all. "They're defensive," Daniel said during their next call. "That's usually a sign that the narrative is collapsing." Faith didn't respond. She had learned that silence, once institutionalized, became powerful. The trustee scheduled another meeting. This one would be more formal. Sworn statements, a record. Daniel prepared Faith carefully, not with scripts, but with reminders. "Answer only what's asked," he said. "Don't fill silence. Don't speculate." Faith nodded. "I understand." The meeting took place in the same federal building, the same room. The air was unchanged, impersonal, neutral. Timothy arrived late. Faith noticed immediately. Not because it mattered legally, but because it mattered symbolically. He was no longer ahead of the timeline. The trustee began by addressing the email. "Mr. Murphy," she said, holding up a printed page, "this correspondence suggests that you were aware of impending filings and acted to separate certain obligations prior to disclosure. Can you explain what you meant by separate personal obligations?" Timothy's attorney shifted in his seat. Timothy inhaled slowly. "I was referring to emotional boundaries," Timothy said. "The marriage was already over." The trustee did not react. "Then why reference filings?" she asked. Timothy hesitated. His answer came slower this time. "I was under stress. I may have used imprecise language." The trustee turned the page. "And what did you mean by move quickly?" Timothy glanced at Faith. It was the first time he had looked at her directly since the meeting began. Faith did not look back. "I meant resolving matters efficiently," he said. The trustee nodded once. "Efficiency does not explain omission," she said calmly. "It explains urgency." She set the email down. Miss Murphy, the trustee, continued turning toward Faith. "Were you informed of any intention to restructure debts prior to your eviction?" No, Faith replied. "Were you informed of any intent to file for bankruptcy prior to your eviction?" No. "Were you consulted about changes to repayment arrangements prior to the cessation of payments?" No. Each answer was the same. Simple, final. The trustee made several notes, then looked back at Timothy. Based on the record, she said there appears to be a pattern of action taken prior to disclosure that materially affected a creditor. She did not say fraud. She did not need to. Timothy's attorney requested a brief recess. The trustee granted it. In the hallway, Daniel stood beside Faith, hands folded. "This is where they usually try to settle," he said quietly. Faith nodded. "I'm not interested in private correction." Daniel looked at her. "I know." When the meeting resumed, the tone had shifted, not adversarial but firmer. The trustee outlined next steps: additional document production, possible referral for further review. Faith listened without expression. Timothy did not. His composure cracked not loudly but visibly. His shoulders slumped. His voice lost its evenness. After the meeting, his attorney approached Daniel. "We'd like to discuss resolution," he said. Daniel glanced at Faith. She shook her head slightly. Daniel turned back. "All communications go through the trustee now." The attorney nodded, understanding the finality. Outside, the afternoon light felt harsher than before. Faith stood on the steps for a moment, letting the building recede behind her. She thought of the email again. How quietly it had waited. How easily it could have remained buried. Words she realized had weight, even when no one thought they did. Especially then. Daniel walked beside her toward the parking lot. "This will likely lead to consequences beyond the debt," he said. "Potential sanctions, possibly worse." Faith nodded. "I didn't ask for that." "I know," Daniel replied. "But you didn't create it either." They stopped at her car. Faith placed her hand on the door handle and paused. "There's something I want to be clear about," she said. Daniel waited. "I don't want his career destroyed," Faith said. "I don't want public spectacle." Daniel met her gaze. "Then you're doing exactly what you should be doing. You're letting the system decide." Faith got into her car and closed the door. As she drove away, she didn't feel triumph. She felt distance. The kind that came when a chapter ended not with drama, but with documentation. Timothy had believed that words could be reshaped after the fact. That intention could be blurred. But emails remembered, records remembered. And the law once engaged did not forget. The video arrived without ceremony. It wasn't delivered dramatically or introduced with warning. Linda Parker sent it in a short message late one evening, apologetic in tone, as if the act of preserving the moment itself required an excuse. I checked my doorbell history. I didn't realize it recorded audio too. If this helps, you can use it. Faith Murphy didn't open the attachment immediately. She thanked Linda first. Then she placed the phone face down on the table and waited until the room felt still. When she finally pressed play, the screen showed a familiar angle, the narrow slice of hallway outside Linda's apartment, the edge of Faith's suitcase visible near the wall. Timothy standing just far enough back to look composed. The audio was clear. Timothy's voice carried without strain. Calm, controlled, confident. "I've already spoken to my lawyer," he said. "I'm bankrupt. This is what has to happen." Faith heard herself speak next, softer, measured. "I'd like copies of the paperwork." Timothy laughed, not loudly but enough. "You'll get what you're entitled to, which isn't much anymore." There was a pause. Someone, Linda Faith realized, shifted behind the door. Then Timothy again. "I can't afford you. I won't carry dead weight into this." The video ended shortly after. Faith sat very still. She did not replay it. She did not analyze it. She knew instinctively what it was: not proof of cruelty, not a record of humiliation, but evidence of state of mind. Intent spoken aloud, framing used publicly, words chosen deliberately not in private anger, but in front of witnesses. She forwarded the file to Daniel Brooks with a brief note. Doorbell video. Includes audio. Date time match eviction. Daniel called her within minutes. This is corroborative, he said. It aligns with everything else. Is it admissible? Faith asked. Yes, Daniel replied. Not for drama, for pattern. That word again. Pattern, Daniel explained carefully. Courts were not moved by isolated moments. They looked for consistency language, repeated behavior, sustained decisions reinforced by context. This shows how he characterized his financial position publicly, Daniel said, and how he characterized you. Faith closed her eyes briefly. I don't want it used to shame him. It won't, Daniel said. It will be used to show alignment between what he said and what he later claimed under oath. The distinction mattered. The trustee requested the video formally 2 days later, along with sworn statements from Linda Parker and Mark Reynolds. Faith helped coordinate, but she did not manage the process herself. Everything moved through official channels now. Linda's statement was precise. She described what she heard, what she saw, and what she did not understand at the time. Mark's statement was shorter. He focused on the paperwork, on what had been presented as final when it was not. Faith read both statements once, then placed them in her folder behind the bank records and emails. She noticed something unexpected as she organized the materials. The humiliation that had felt so heavy the night of the eviction had lost its emotional charge. Not because it no longer mattered, but because it had been contextualized. It was no longer something that happened to her. It was something that revealed him. The trustee scheduled another session. This one would include review of corroborative evidence. Daniel prepared Faith as before. You won't need to say much, he said. If anything, Faith nodded. She trusted the process now, not blindly, but confidently. The meeting was quieter than the last. Fewer interruptions, more reading. The trustee played a portion of the video, not the entire clip, just enough. Timothy's voice filled the room, stripped of intention and tone flattened into record. I'm bankrupt. This is what has to happen. The trustee paused the video. Mr. Murphy, she said, this statement was made prior to your filing. At that time, you had not disclosed all assets or transfers. Can you explain why you presented your financial status as final? Timothy's attorney began to speak, then stopped. Timothy answered himself. I believed it to be accurate, he said, based on what the trustee asked. Timothy hesitated. Faith watched him now, not with resentment, but with distance. She could see the strain in his jaw, the calculation behind his eyes. He was no longer performing for sympathy. He was performing for survival. The trustee moved on. She referenced the video again when discussing intent. The words, dead weight, appeared in the transcript. The trustee did not repeat them aloud. She did not need to. Miss Murphy, she said, turning to Faith, did Mr. Murphy ever characterize your loans as spousal support prior to this proceeding? No, Faith replied. Did he ever dispute the existence of the debt before filing? No. The trustee nodded. She made a note and closed the folder. At the end of the session, she spoke plainly. There is sufficient evidence to suggest that the debtor acted with awareness of obligations and took steps to avoid full disclosure prior to filing, she said. This matter will be referred for further review. She did not look at Faith when she said it. She did not need to. The weight of that sentence settled slowly. Afterward, in the hallway, Timothy approached Daniel. His voice was low, urgent. We can fix this, he said. We can correct the record. Daniel replied calmly. The record corrects itself. Timothy looked past him toward Faith. She met his eyes for the first time in weeks. There was no accusation in her expression, no triumph, just recognition. She turned away without speaking. Outside, the air was cold. Faith pulled her coat tighter and stood beside Daniel for a moment. This goes beyond repayment now, Daniel said. Faith nodded. I know. Are you okay with that? Faith considered the question carefully. I'm okay with the truth, she said, wherever it leads. That night, Faith returned to her temporary apartment and sat at the small desk by the window. She opened her laptop and reviewed the case updates. New entries appeared. Notes, referrals, deadlines. She closed the screen and looked out at the city. The humiliation that had once felt like an ending had become a beginning not of revenge, but of clarity. The video that captured her silence had preserved something else as well. Restraint. She had not defended herself. She had not raised her voice. She had let others hear what mattered. And now those words lived where that they could not be edited or reframed. On paper, on record. Faith turned off the light and lay down. For the first time, she felt certain that whatever came next would not depend on how convincingly Timothy spoke, but on what had already been proven. The meeting of creditors was scheduled for a Tuesday morning, early enough that the city outside the federal building still felt half asleep. Faith Murphy arrived 15 minutes early, as Daniel Brooks had advised. Not because punctuality impressed anyone, but because it removed variables. She sat in the waiting area with her folder in her lap, posture relaxed, attention steady. Around her, other debtors and creditors murmured quietly. Some looked anxious. Some looked resigned. Faith looked observant. Timothy Murphy arrived 5 minutes late. He took a seat across the room, his attorney beside him, papers arranged with exaggerated care. Faith noticed that he did not look toward her immediately. When he finally did, his gaze slid past her, as if she were part of the furniture. The trustee, Karen Mitchell, entered without ceremony. She greeted no one personally. She took her seat, opened a file, and began. The 341 meeting followed a predictable rhythm. Names were called. Oaths were administered. Questions were asked and answered in language stripped of drama. When Timothy's name was called, he stood. His voice when he spoke was even, practiced. He confirmed his identity, his address, his understanding of the proceedings. Then the questions began. "Have you listed all of your assets?" the trustee asked. "Yes," Timothy replied. "Have you listed all of your creditors?" "Yes." The trustee paused, then looked down at the file. "Mr. Murphy," she said, "please explain the discrepancy between the amount owed to Faith Murphy, as listed in your schedules, and the amount documented in her proof of claim." Timothy's attorney leaned forward. "There may be differing interpretations of the nature of those funds." The trustee raised a hand. "I'm asking Mr. Murphy." Timothy swallowed. They were informal arrangements, he said. Support, not loans in the traditional sense. The trustee nodded once. "Miss Murphy," she said, turning toward Faith, "how would you characterize those transfers?" Faith stood when she spoke, not because she had to, but because it felt correct. "They were loans," she said, "documented as such at the time they were made." "Did you expect repayment?" the trustee asked. "Yes." "Was repayment discussed?" "Yes, in writing." "Did you consent to a reduction or a cessation of repayment prior to the filing?" "No." Faith sat back down. The trustee made a note, then continued. "Mr. Murphy," she said, "are you aware that mischaracterizing debt can affect the outcome of these proceedings?" "Yes," Timothy replied, his voice tighter now. The trustee moved on to the subject of transfers. "Within 90 days prior to filing," she said, "you transferred funds to an entity registered to Rachel Collins. Please explain the purpose of those transfers." Timothy glanced at his attorney, then answered. "Consulting services." "What services?" the trustee asked. "Strategic planning," Timothy repeated. "Do you have invoices?" the trustee asked. "We are locating them," the attorney said quickly. The trustee nodded, expression unchanged. "Please provide them within the requested time frame." She turned back to her notes. "Miss Murphy," she said again, "did you have knowledge of or consent to these transfers at the time they occurred?" "No," Faith replied. The trustee closed the file. "Thank you," she said. "That'll be all for now." There was no gavel, no declaration, just a quiet finality that settled over the room. After the meeting, Timothy approached Daniel in the hallway. His tone was low, urgent, stripped of performance. "This has gone further than it needed to," Timothy said. "We can settle the debt. Make this go away." Daniel responded evenly. "The process doesn't work that way." Timothy's eyes flicked toward Faith. "You don't have to do this." Faith did not respond. She did not meet his gaze. Daniel stepped slightly between them. "All communication goes through counsel." Timothy exhaled sharply and turned away. Outside, Faith stood on the steps of the building for a moment, letting the cool air steady her. The meeting had not been dramatic, but it had been definitive. She was no longer an omission. She was no longer a footnote. She was the primary unsecured creditor. Daniel joined her. "This shifts priority," he said. "In any restructuring, your claim comes first among unsecured debts." Faith nodded. "I didn't ask for that, I know," Daniel said, "but it's where the facts lead." Over the next week, the consequences began to surface quietly. Timothy's accounts were partially frozen pending review. His business partners requested clarification. Meetings were postponed. Contracts were reevaluated. Faith learned about these things indirectly, through silence where there had once been noise, through emails that stopped arriving, through Linda Parker's occasional updates. "He doesn't come by much anymore," Linda said in one message. "When he does, he looks like he's waiting for something to fall." Faith read the message and did not reply immediately. She had learned that waiting did not mean watching. The trustee issued a formal notice. Further examination was required. Certain transfers would be scrutinized. Certain claims would be prioritized. Daniel explained it simply. "The case is no longer about whether he owes you," he said. "That's been established. It's about how he handled that obligation." Faith considered this. "And if they determine misconduct?" she asked. "There may be sanctions," Daniel said. "Possibly a denial of discharge for certain debts." Faith closed her eyes briefly. She had not wanted to be central to his collapse. She had wanted accuracy. But she understood now that systems did not separate truth from consequence. They followed, one into the other. That evening, Faith sat alone at her desk and reviewed her folder one last time. She did not add anything. She did not reorganize. She closed it gently and placed it in her bag. The eviction that had begun this process felt distant now, not because it had faded, but because it had been contextualized. It was no longer a wound. It was a data point. Faith had been humiliated publicly, but she had been restored procedurally. And in a system that valued order over performance, that distinction mattered. She turned off the light and went to bed knowing something she hadn't known that night in the parking lot. Power did not belong to the person who spoke the loudest. It belonged to the person whose story held when everything else was stripped away. The formal objection arrived 3 days after the meeting of creditors. It was not addressed to Faith Murphy. It did not need to be. The document bore the trustee's seal and was served to Timothy Murphy and his attorney, outlining concerns in language that was precise and unsparing. Failure to accurately disclose creditor obligations, questionable transfers within the pre-filing period, potential concealment of assets. Daniel Brooks forwarded the objection to Faith with a single line. "This is the pressure point." Faith read the document carefully. She noticed what it did not say as much as what it did. There were no accusations of malice, no moral judgments, only descriptions of actions and their legal implications. This was the law, at its most exacting, measured, unemotional, and difficult to argue with. Daniel called her that afternoon. "They're asking the court to examine the transfers more deeply," he said, "including whether the debt to you should be excluded from discharge." Faith leaned back in her chair. "Meaning he may still owe me, regardless of the outcome?" "Yes," Daniel replied, "and potentially face additional consequences." Faith was silent for a moment. "What happens next?" "He'll respond," Daniel said, "either with evidence or with explanations. If the explanations don't hold, the court will decide." Faith thanked him and ended the call. Within hours, Timothy began reaching out. The first message was a text. Short, direct. "We need to talk." Faith did not respond. The second came through email. "This is getting out of hand. I never meant for it to escalate like this." Faith read it once and forwarded it to Daniel. The third arrived late at night from a number she did not recognize. A voicemail. Faith Timothy said, his voice stripped of the calm confidence she remembered. "I don't understand why you're doing this. You know I was under pressure. You know I didn't have a choice." Faith deleted the message. The next morning, Daniel sent her an update. His attorney has filed a response, he said. It's long, defensive, heavy on justification. "Does it address the transfers?" Faith asked. "Yes," Daniel replied. "Poorly." Faith closed her eyes briefly. The response argued necessity, that Timothy had acted quickly to preserve what remained of his business, that the transfers to Rachel Collins's LLC were legitimate expenses, that the omission of Faith's full claim had been an oversight. Daniel did not sound convinced. "They're asking the court to accept intent as mitigation," he said. "But the paper trail contradicts that." Faith considered this. "Do I need to do anything?" "Not yet," Daniel said. "We let the objection stand. The court will schedule a hearing." The hearing date arrived 2 weeks later. Faith marked it on her calendar without ceremony. In the meantime, the consequences of the objection rippled outward. Timothy's business partner requested an emergency meeting. Contracts were paused. A bank flagged his accounts for review. None of this was dramatic. It happened quietly through emails and calendar changes and automated notifications. Faith learned of it indirectly through silence where there had once been constant noise. Linda Parker sent a message one evening. "I ran into him in the lobby. He looked like he didn't know where to stand." Faith did not reply. She was not interested in his discomfort. She was interested in resolution. The hearing took place in a small courtroom, sparsely attended. No audience, no reporters. Just the judge, the trustee, the attorneys, and the record. Faith sat behind Daniel, hands folded, eyes forward. The trustee summarized the objection. The sequence of events, the transfers, the omissions. Timothy's attorney responded with practiced language, emphasizing stress, complexity, and misunderstanding. Then the judge asked a question that cut through everything. "Mr. Murphy," she said, "why did you evict your wife before filing?" The room was very still. Timothy shifted in his seat. "I believed it was necessary," he said. "Necessary for what the judge asked." "To manage my finances," Timothy replied. The judge nodded once. "And did you disclose to her that you intended to file?" "No," Timothy said. "Did you disclose to the court in your initial filing the full extent of her claim?" "No," Timothy admitted. The judge looked down at the file. "And during that same period," she continued, "you transferred funds to a third-party entity." Why? Timothy hesitated. His attorney began to speak, then stopped. "For consulting services," Timothy said again. The judge leaned forward slightly. "Do you have invoices?" Timothy did not answer immediately. "No," he said finally. The judge sat back. The decision was not rendered that day. It did not need to be. The judge took the matter under advisement and scheduled a follow-up. Outside the courtroom, Timothy approached Daniel again. His voice was urgent, unsteady. "Tell her I'll fix this," he said. "Tell her I'll pay her back. Everything." Daniel looked at him steadily. "That opportunity passed when you chose omission." Timothy's gaze flicked toward Faith. "You wanted this." Faith met his eyes briefly. "No," she said. "I wanted accuracy." She turned and walked away. The ruling arrived a week later. The court sustained the trustee's objection. The debt to Faith Murphy was deemed valid and non-dischargeable, pending further proceedings. Certain transfers were flagged for potential recovery. Additional review was authorized. Daniel called her as soon as he received the notice. "This is significant," he said. "He can't erase the obligation, and the court is signaling concern." Faith sat quietly, absorbing the information. "What does this mean for him?" she asked. "It means consequences," Daniel replied. "Professionally, financially. And for me?" Faith asked. "It means your claim stands," Daniel said. "And your position is protected." That night, Timothy sent one final message. "I never thought you'd do this to me." Faith read it once. Then she deleted it. She understood now that Timothy's greatest misunderstanding was not about money or law. It was about agency. He believed Faith's silence meant consent, that her patience meant compliance, that her restraint meant absence. The objection had corrected that misunderstanding. Faith spent the next few days preparing for the final phase settlement discussions' asset recovery closure. She did so without anticipation or anxiety. The story was no longer unfolding unpredictably. It was converging. She placed her folder on the shelf and closed the door to the room where she had lived inside documents for so long. The law had taken over now, and it would finish what facts had begun. The consequences did not arrive all at once. They came in increments measured, procedural, and difficult to dramatize. Faith Murphy learned this as the weeks unfolded, each development arriving not as a shock, but as a confirmation of a path already set. Timothy Murphy's accounts were not emptied overnight. They were restricted, monitored, subject to review. Payments he expected to clear did not. Automatic withdrawals paused. Notifications replaced certainty. His business partner withdrew from negotiations, quietly citing ongoing legal exposure. A lender requested updated disclosures. A contract renewal stalled without explanation. None of it made headlines. None of it needed to. Faith learned about these changes secondhand, mostly through Daniel Brooks. The court has authorized further recovery review, Daniel told her during one of their calls. Certain transfers may be clawed back. Faith listened without comment. And there's more, Daniel added. The judge has signaled concern about credibility. That has implications beyond this case. Faith understood what he meant. Credibility, once questioned, followed a person. It did not stay contained within a single file. Timothy, meanwhile, grew quieter. The messages stopped. The calls ceased. Even the attempts to negotiate through counsel softened their urgency, replaced by caution. He was no longer trying to rewrite the story. He was trying to survive it. Faith did not take satisfaction in this. She noticed instead a different feeling emerging distance. The emotional kind. The kind that came when someone's actions no longer felt personal but historical. The settlement discussions began formally the following month. Daniel laid out the options clearly. The court will prioritize repayment, he said. There may be a structured plan. You'll recover what's owed over time. Faith nodded. I'm not looking for punishment. I know, Daniel said. That actually helps. They negotiated quietly. No raised voices, no dramatic demands. Timothy's attorney agreed to terms that acknowledged the full debt, the timeline, and the oversight of the trustee. Faith signed the agreement without ceremony. She noticed something as she did. Her hands were steady. The signature did not feel like victory. It felt like closure. Outside the legal process, Faith began to rebuild her life deliberately. She found a small apartment on the other side of town. Nothing luxurious, nothing symbolic. Just space. Light. Quiet. She unpacked slowly, choosing where things belonged instead of filling corners in a rush. The suitcase she had packed in 20 minutes now sat empty in a closet, zipper closed. Linda Parker visited once, bringing coffee and conversation that avoided the past. He doesn't come by anymore, Linda said at one point gently. Faith nodded. That's probably for the best. They spoke about ordinary things after that. Work, weather, plans. Faith noticed how much she appreciated the absence of tension. How silence now felt restful instead of ominous. Daniel called her one afternoon with a final update. The court has approved the settlement framework, he said. Your claim is secured. Payments will begin next quarter. Thank you, Faith said. There's one more thing, Daniel added. The trustee has referred aspects of the case for professional review. That may affect Timothy's standing in certain circles. Faith closed her eyes briefly. I didn't ask for that. No, Daniel said. But you didn't prevent it either. Faith considered this after the call ended. She had not acted to destroy Timothy's career. She had not spoken ill of him publicly. She had not sought exposure. She had simply refused to disappear. That refusal had consequences not because it was loud, but because it was consistent. Weeks later, Faith received a letter from Timothy's attorney confirming the first scheduled payment. It was impersonal, precise, everything the relationship had not been. She placed the letter in a folder labeled Simply Resolved. She did not keep copies of the emails anymore. She did not reread transcripts or statements. She did not need to. The system had absorbed them. One evening, as she walked home from work, Faith passed the kind of parking lot where the eviction had taken place. Different building, same lights, same flat glow. She paused for a moment, not out of pain, but out of recognition. That woman with the suitcase had believed she was being reduced. She hadn't been. She had been clarified. Faith continued walking. Timothy's life would continue reshaped by decisions he had made long before the court became involved. The law had not punished him. It had revealed him. Faith's life would continue too quietly, deliberately, without the need to prove anything further. She had not raised her voice. She had not demanded belief. She had documented, and in doing so, she had left with something more enduring than revenge. She had left with her name restored. The final papers arrived on a quiet morning, not by courier, not marked urgent, just a standard envelope addressed correctly, this time delivered without announcement. Faith Murphy opened it at her kitchen table, sunlight resting softly across the wood, the city outside, beginning its day without reference to her history. She read the documents once, then again, slower. The settlement terms were clear. The debt was acknowledged in full. The payment schedule was precise, overseen, enforceable. Language replaced ambiguity. Structure replaced promise. Faith signed where indicated, placed the pages back into the envelope, and sealed it. There was no ceremony to mark the moment, no one to call, no message to send. The process had concluded the way it had unfolded through procedure, not spectacle. Later that afternoon, Daniel Brooks called to confirm receipt. "That's it," he said. "From here, the system does what it's designed to do." Faith thanked him. She did not linger on the call. Afterward, she sat for a while, without moving, letting the quiet settle. It was a different quiet than the one she had felt on the night of the eviction. That silence had been sharp, exposed, waiting to be filled. This one was complete. She stood and opened the window. The sounds of the street rose, traffic, footsteps, the ordinary rhythms of people moving forward. Faith noticed how little her body reacted now to those sounds. No flinch, no anticipation. She had learned what stability felt like. Over the following weeks, life returned to its scale. Faith went to work. She paid rent. She cooked meals she enjoyed and let dishes sit overnight when she felt like it. She rearranged the bookshelf twice before deciding it didn't matter. The payments began on schedule. Faith checked the first deposit once confirmed the amount and closed the app. She did not refresh. She did not calculate future installments. She trusted the mechanism because she had helped build it. Occasionally, Timothy's name appeared in her peripheral vision on a forwarded email, in a legal update, in a message from Linda Parker, who mentioned in passing that he had moved out of the building. Faith did not ask where. She did not wonder how. She understood now that curiosity could be a form of attachment, and attachment was no longer necessary. One evening, months later, Faith found the suitcase she had packed in 20 minutes, still tucked into the back of her closet. She pulled it out and opened it. Inside were items she had never unpacked. A sweater, a notebook, a pair of shoes she hadn't worn since before everything changed. She removed them and folded the suitcase flat, sliding it beneath the bed. The gesture was simple, but it mattered. Faith thought back to the night she had stood under the parking lot lights, listening as Timothy explained her absence as inevitability, as bankruptcy, as burden. She remembered how little she had said. She remembered how much she had written down instead. In the end, it had not been anger that carried her through the process. It had not been pride or vengeance or the desire to be right. It had been discipline. The discipline to wait. The discipline to record. The discipline to let systems function as intended. Faith had not needed to announce her strength. She had demonstrated it by refusing to abandon accuracy when it was inconvenient. That choice had cost her time, comfort, certainty. But it had returned something else. Her name, her credibility, her future. On a Sunday morning, Faith walked through a park near her apartment, the air cool and open. She sat on a bench and watched families pass, couples argue quietly, joggers move with purpose. No one looked at her. She liked that. She had learned that being unseen was not the same as being erased. That sometimes the most powerful outcomes arrived without witnesses. The law had not praised her. It had not rewarded her patience with applause. It had simply done its work. And Faith had allowed it to. As she stood to leave, her phone vibrated once a routine notification confirming the next scheduled payment. She acknowledged it without opening the details and slipped the phone back into her pocket. She walked on. There would be no reconciliation, no final conversation, no apology dramatic enough to change the past. Faith did not need any of that. She had left the story with what she entered it possessing and more: clarity, autonomy, peace. Some endings demanded noise. This one did not. It closed the way it had always been, moving quietly, deliberately, and with the dignity of a record that held. When people talk about strength, they often imagine noise, raised voices, public victories, visible defeat. But this story offers a quieter truth. Real strength is not always reactive. Sometimes it is deliberate restraint. Sometimes it is the decision to write things down when others speak loosely. Sometimes it is trusting that systems built on truth will eventually surface what performance tries to hide. Faith Murphy did not win because she was louder, faster, or more aggressive. She prevailed because she understood something many people overlook. Dignity is not proven in arguments, it is preserved in consistency. She did not rush to defend herself when she was humiliated. She did not trade accuracy for emotional relief. She allowed time records and procedure to do what confrontation never could: separate truth from narrative. There's a lesson here that reaches far beyond law or money. In relationships, in workplaces, in families, people are often pressured to react immediately, to explain themselves, to justify their worth in moments of crisis. But reacting is not always power. Sometimes pausing is. Sometimes the most meaningful response is to document, to observe, and to wait until the right moment to speak, when words will matter and when they cannot be twisted. This story is also a reminder that silence is not weakness when it is chosen. Silence backed by clarity, preparation, and self-respect becomes a form of authority. Faith did not seek to destroy anyone. She did not pursue humiliation in return. She simply refused to disappear. And that refusal, quiet, steady, and principled, should change the outcome. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to reflect on where you might be underestimating your own quiet strength. Have you been rushing to explain yourself when patience would serve you better? Have you been doubting the value of restraint in a world that rewards noise? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Share in the comments what part of this story stayed with you, or what lesson it reminded you of in your own life. And if you believe stories about dignity, accountability, and real justice deserve space in your feed, consider subscribing to the channel. Not for drama, but for stories that leave something lasting behind.